Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com with a state masterclass. Just kind of a quick rundown on sort of state in terms of a functional hooks. Again, most of these videos I generally do are focused on React functional components. You can watch my older videos as far as how to do things in class components. But yes, here we go. So what is state? So there's basically two main special types of data in React. There's props, and props is generally information from the outside. So you're a component, and the component that renders you, your parent component, sends you data via props. Okay, so they send you by putting in properties in the tag that renders the tag, okay, or the component. Now state is internal. Okay, state essentially is data that generally reflects how the component should render. Okay, you could have variables that are not state, but what's special about state is that when state changes, the component updates. So generally, if it's something like that determines like the color of the component, it probably should be state. If it's something that's going to affect how your UI functions or appears, it should be saved in state. So that way every time the state changes, the component changes by rebuilding itself. Okay, so first let's just talk about how you create state. Okay, so for example, if I wanted to do, and you can call this whatever you want, so I just create a variable, const, if I did this, const state equals react dot use state, and we'll just say that this state equals an empty object, just to kind of illustrate a point. So this function, what it does, it's going to return you state. Okay, and again, it's just basically we're taking whatever is inside this. This is like the initial value, so we can actually make it an object that has a value. So name Alex Merced. So that's the initial value of my state. It's an object with a property called name that is Alex Merced. That is the starting value of my state. Now if I console.log state, let's see what I end up getting. Okay, so I open up my console, and notice that it's not an object, it's an array. And it's an array with two items. The first one is my object, and the second one is a function. Because technically, what the useState function returns is an array with my state and a function to update my state. So this is why typically what we do is we're going to destructure the results of react.useState. So we're going to say state, we want that first thing in the array to go inside the variable state, and we want the second thing to go in a variable called setState. And you could call it whatever you want, but the convention is the name of your, whatever you want to call this first variable, and then the function is always called set the name of the variable, because it's to set that variable. That just allows it to you to know what it does. Okay, cool. So I can then use that variable. So let's say I just want to put that here. Okay, and then if I do that, I just say, hey, I want this to be state.name, because again, state is the object, and the object has a property called name, Alex. So there we see Alex Merced. So it's just a variable like any other variable. But now let's see what happens. So first we're going to create a function to change the variable. So we'll just say const handle click, because this is going to be for a button, where we click on a button. And we're just going to say that if you click on this, okay, that if you click on this, we're going to take state.name, and state.name will now equal Bob Jones. Now this is not how you're supposed to change the state. You're not supposed to directly edit the state. So I'm only showing you to show you that this does not work. So that's the function. Now we need to create something that uses that function. So I'm going to create a button. Okay, and then we'll say click me, and we'll close that button. Okay, so see, there's the button, which should be below. Oh, I deleted everything. So h1 state.name h1. Okay. So now let's give this function to the button. So I'm going to say it's an on-click event, meaning when you click the button. And when you click the button, the function that is run is handle-click. Okay. And then I just want a console log so we can see that the state changed. Console.log state. Okay. So we see that the first console log, where did the first console log go? This console log is still console logging the object with the name Alex Merced. Now if I click the button, see the object did change. I did change the state. See, its value is now Bob Jones. You can see in the console log, but the UI didn't update because the component doesn't know just because you changed the variable name. It's not watching the variable. It's not looking for the variable's change. The way it knows to update is because you use that special function. So now let's try this again. Now let's say instead of saying state.name equals bob.jones, I use the setState function to update the state. Oops. I'm going to use that setState function. So replace this, say setState, and I'm going to set state to an object, except now the object has the property of name, still does, except now it's Bob Jones. Okay, because what it does is whatever I pass in the setState, it replaces state with that. So basically, before being an object with a property of name, Alex Merced, now it's a object with a property of name with Bob Jones. So now if I refresh this, so as we go back to our starting place, I click the button, and see it changes to Bob Jones. Okay, because what's happening is it updates the state and then re-renders the component. So the component then re-renders or rebuilds itself with the new information. Now notice something here. Notice the second console log still says Alex Merced. That's actually this one right here. So even though we saw that it successfully changed the state, why would this console log still show Alex Merced? The reason being is that state is actually asynchronous. Okay, the way it sets the state. So that means this might. Then the reason they did it that way is so that way your code just doesn't just like get stuck there while your state updates. Because what if you're doing a huge change to state? It might take like a second, and now your app's just kind of stuck, and that doesn't really look good. So the rest of this function still runs after setState begins doing the thing. So this console log runs before setState is complete, and then once this is complete, it triggers the render of the component. Okay, so technically this console log still belongs to the component while it's in its original state, and then the component rebuilds itself with the new state. Because again, in React, really what you're doing is you're kind of painting a picture, and then the picture's rebuilding itself every time you change the data. That's sort of the purpose of state. You're telling the component, hey, things have changed, rebuild yourself, re-render yourself. Okay, so if you think about it this way, you're really just describing how something looks at a moment, and then it just rebuilds that picture every time you change the data. Every time you change the state, it begins to make a lot more sense. So that's how state works. Now where things get a little tricky is oftentimes what happens when you want children of a component to work with that component state. So let's create a file, children.js. Okay, import React from React. Const child equals. Oh, I should have props. And right now we'll just return h1 child. Okay, and then we'll export that component. Export default child. There we go. Then we'll import it here. Import child from /children. Okay, cool. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put child here. There's child. So we see the child. And I'm going to get rid of all this. So I have my state and app, but what if I want child to do all that stuff? Do I need to like recreate? I could recreate the state and the function in child, but what if I really need the state and app because I need the state for other things, for other components? Then what I can do is I can pass the function and the state to the child as a prop. Okay? So what I can do is I'll pass, you know, name, and that'll just equal state.name. And then I'll pass the, we'll call it the click prop. And the click prop will just equal the handle click function that we defined already. So essentially what you want to do is just define functions that update your state here and then pass them to whatever components are needed. Okay, because here you're in scope. You have access to the state and set state function here. So in that case, define the function here in app and then pass it down as a prop, and then other components that are children can then update app state because you've given them a function that updates the state of app. And that's kind of how you can grab information from your children, because you can give parameters and then you pass the data from the child. The child invokes the function. So just to show you an example, let's do this. Let's change the handle click a little bit and say that it takes a parameter called name. Okay, and then what this does is that it's going to take that name variable and set the name to that. So that way we can change how this handle click works. So we pass that down the child. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a div. And in this div, what I want is an h1 that shows the name. So now it's props.name, because again, in this component received the name via prop, so it's props.name. Okay, so we see that there. Now again, let me refresh it so it shows the original value. There we go. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little input. And we'll call the input name. Actually, we'll just do different buttons. I don't want to get too complicated with the inputs and all that stuff. So we'll do a button. And this one will be Bob Jones. And we're going to do an on-click. Now, generally, when you pass a function to an on-click, you just pass a function like this, props.handleClick. Problem is, I want to pass an argument. Because again, handleClick, and it's not even handleClick anymore, it's props.click. Because the prop is called click. So in that component, it's called click. It's whatever the prop name is in the tag. But I want to be able to pass that name variable here. So how am I supposed to pass this function here? So when you want to pass an argument to this function, what you do is you have to wrap it in another function. So you make this an arrow function. So really now it's an arrow. What we're really passing is an arrow function, and that arrow function is invoking click. And then I can pass in Bob Jones. Okay, now I can create several instances of this. Oops. You can have different names. We'll just call this one John. Keep it simple. Cheese. And so basically what I'm saying is, like, when you click on this button, it's going to run a function that runs this function. And this allows me to actually like pass arguments to that other function. So I can be like Bob Jones, John, cheese, John, Bob John, cheese. Okay, and see, I can change my state, and every time I change my state, the component rebuilds itself. That's why that console log keeps running, because this component is being reread into the computer. So this console log that's in the body of the component gets read again. Okay, this is why later on you'll want to use useState, because you don't necessarily want everything happening every time. But yeah, so that's essentially state. So again, things to remember: anything that's going to affect how your component works, that you really want to take effect as it changes, should be state. Should be defined in a variable that's created through this useState pattern. Anytime you change the value of that state, it should always be done by the setState function. Okay. Now, if you're going to pass, if you want a child component to be able to update and use that state, you pass it as props. Okay. The best thing you can do is define the function that updates a state in the parent component, then pass that function down as a prop. And then you can pass the actual state down as a prop as well. Cool. Yeah, and then that's how that works. And then again, generally, if you want to pass a function as an event listener, but you want to be able to use arguments in that function, the strategy is you could either write another function up here, or you could just pass an arrow function and say in that arrow function we will do this function. So I'm just saying, when this arrow function that has no name is invoked, when this button is clicked, that function then does this invocation of props.click. And again, props.click was a prop called click, for which we pass down the handle click function. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day. And again, don't forget to join the Slack and Discord community over there at devnursery.com. And I'll see you guys later on.